Now, I'd like to welcome this first panel of the event. We've got a great set of speakers. So if I can welcome to the stage Emma Latham-Jones, Senior Manager for Biodiversity at Share Action. Cheryl Senhouse, Finance Innovation Director at the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. Please come up and get a seat. Yuri Suarez, the Chief Impact Officer at the Inter-America Development Lab. Tom Bishop, the Senior Finance Advisor at the Research Triangle Institute International. Ahmed Wahid, the Director of Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment and Energy of the Maldives. And Taiji Watanabe, Technical Advisor at the Japan International Cooperation Organization. Thank you all for being here with us this morning. Now we have a full panel, so I'd like to start off just by asking you, on this conversation today we'll be discussing the green finance pathway specifically for small island developing states and the unique economies that the SIDS countries have in many ways limits the access that they have in these conversations. As we know from earlier this week, the Loss and Damage Fund announcement, now the big conversation is how is that process going to work and how is that going to impact small island developing states specifically. So we'll start on this side, and I'll ask each of the speakers just for a minute or two to introduce themselves a little bit and tell us their initial opening thoughts on the green finance pathway for SIDS. So Emma, we can start with you.
Thank you. So I'm Emma Latham-Jones. I'm the Senior Biodiversity Manager at Share Action. Share Action is a responsible investment NGO, and we drive ambition around standards of responsible investment through policy work, engagement with corporations, and most importantly, our work with large coalitions of investors across the globe. I think I'll start, before we get into the nitty-gritty of economic diversification and public-private investing, etc., I want to make two observations. One is that SIDS, small islands, developing states, are not actually so small. So if we look at the EEZ of SIDS, if we look at the area of ocean under their control, it's 28 times their landmass. If we look at the natural resources, the ocean natural resources, under their stewardship, it's 30% of the globe, 30%. And secondly, when we talk about SIDS, obviously there is an element of urgency and tragedy. There's a moral imperative. But there's also the fact that they are serving us. They are serving us by being among the most biodiverse places in the world. They're serving humanity. They're responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And they are helping humanity become more resilient to this crisis. And I think we want to remember that when we talk about financing, that this isn't charity. This is a need for us. For us, I mean, I say that as someone who's based in London, but across the globe, we need the indigenous wisdom. We need the biodiverse hotspots. We need it. So they're serving us, and I think we need to remember that when we talk about conditionality around debt and around investments, that this isn't a one sort of charity thing. This is us needing them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that introduction. We'll go next to Cheryl.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Cheryl Senhouse. I'm the Finance Innovation Director with the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. We are a civil society organization in the Caribbean, representing a coalition of 28 countries across the Caribbean and Central and South America. Our work is quite similar to Emma's in that we work through collaboration and partnership, building a pipeline of projects from within our region, as well as building a pipeline of investors who are able to mobilize and channel capital to those projects within our pipeline. We also, through our work, are very much focused on the type of financing that is available. So to answer your question specifically, James, in terms of the green financing pathway for SIDS, our experience to date has taught us that there's the big opportunity to change what financing looks like for SIDS. We have found through our work that there is capital available, but it's very traditional capital that looks at projects in the way that they've looked at projects for the last 100 years. We're facing a new crisis. Our economies experience peculiar and specific challenges, and high debt burdens, high cost of capital, high risk ratings for both projects emanating from our countries as well as sovereign risks that are regarded as very high. Those things exacerbate our ability to find funding and to find funding that meets our needs, not just at the country level, but at the level of the microeconomy, at the level of individual projects. And we have found that there is an amazing opportunity to shift the way that we look at allocation of capital into our economies. There is a huge opportunity for providing additional support for project preparation, for feasibility, and not just preparation in terms of technical studies, but also incubation of projects, helping persons from our small economies to be able to develop large-scale projects and to think of them in a way that allows for aggregation and scalability. And we'd also want to look at the opportunities for accessing different types of funding. What is the role that the private sector plays? What role does philanthropy play? What role does the multilateral development community play in de-risking and allowing for the mobilization of private capital by providing incentives, guarantees, insurance, and other forms of financing that help us crowd in private finance for SIDS? And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And I've got to say, after almost 3 years of working with the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, this is the first time Cheryl and I have met in person, so it's very, very exciting to see these faces we know from Zoom in person. Now, we'll go next to Yuri. I presume when the AIDB, when it comes to AIDB, SIDS, we're really talking about the Caribbean mostly. So from your side and from the lab side, what is your engagement with SIDS?
Yeah, no, this is a critical question for us. First of all, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be in this panel with such illustrious people, so wonderful to be here. Yesterday, our president, Elon Goldfein, announced the One Caribbean initiative, right? So, and that goes directly to your question. What is the One Caribbean initiative? We're announcing an initiative that has essentially four pillars. It's a very robust, ambitious initiative to push the Caribbean forward in terms of resilience and growth. The first pillar is all about climate resilience and investment in climate resilience. The second pillar is to engage the private sector and innovation, and that's where we're here to accelerate new ideas and to accelerate new solutions for the Caribbean. The third pillar is about productivity, and it's about some of these other enabling conditions that the Caribbean needs, right? So it's can't just address climate, you have to address other issues such as food security, such as energy, such as crime, which is an issue of the Caribbean. So that's the third pillar. And then there's a pillar on partnerships that we're also announcing, which comes together with a project preparation or acceleration facility that will help our partners in the Caribbean be able to develop and present projects, both private and public sector, that can be financed, really because we don't have a lot of time to waste here. So we really need to move quickly on this. And we fully expect this initiative to be a game changer for us in the Caribbean in the next few years.
Thank you very much for that. Now, we'll go to you next, Tom. So RTI International. You work in a range of different sectors and would love your insights on this broader question, but also specifically, what is your role and what is the work that you do with SIDS to start off?
Yeah, thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Tom Bishop. I'm a Senior Climate Finance Advisor for RTI International. RTI is a global nonprofit research institution and also a development organization. So they have the advantage of implementing development projects throughout the globe, and we can see what activities some countries are taking to navigate the Paris Agreement pathway, and then apply them to different contexts and the unique context in the SIDS. So I think it's helpful to kind of bucket the different sources of climate finance, international versus domestic, public versus private. And for SIDS especially, they really need to rely on that international public bucket because they have small economies, they're the worst hit by climate change. So we've seen some good successes so far with the Loss and Damage Fund, The Bridgetown Initiative, coming out of SIDS, has some interesting proposals that hopefully gain traction. So that public finance is very important and should be used to kind of de-risk and crowd in private finance. So I think there's a consensus now that the majority or almost all of the financing needed to meet the climate challenge will have to come from the international private sector. So how can you crowd them in with public finance, through these instruments that we'll talk about today? Moving over to the domestic side, since you need that international private finance, what are the different policy tools and enabling frameworks you can put in place to make private investors comfortable investing in your country, but then also create your own domestic markets for climate finance? I think in SIDS and a lot of developing countries, SMEs make up, a primary part of the economy. So looking at the financial sector, which is their, main source of finance, what type of policies can you put in place to either regulate or incentivize the financial sector to provide more climate finance to SMEs? So I'll leave it at that. That's a little bird's eye view. But
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Taiji, we'll go to you next. Unfortunately, it looks like your colleague, Mr. Wahid from the Maldives, was not able to join us, but I know that you're also working in the Maldives and maybe can share some insight there. What does Japan's engagement with SIDS look like in terms of the work that you do?
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Taiji Watanabe from Japan International Cooperation Agency. I work in the climate change department of JICA. And one thing that JICA has put a lot of effort is on climate finance. It's not just climate. We have to tackle sustainable development as well. You have to go hand to hand doing climate actions and also tackling the development issue as well. So we need to we at JICA use the ODA. So we have a budget, and you have to use very efficiently, not just climate change, but sustainable development as well. I think in the context of SIDS, it's very important to tackle both of them. And there is another point that as we use the ODA, we need to harness different sources of fundings. One of the fundings that we are using is the GCF fund. That we see that it's very difficult for the SIDS to access this fund because of bureaucracy, lack of information. But we are, as JICA, as the accredited entity, we are doing our hard process on the formulation of the project, partnering with our partner countries to make this process smoothly and implement project as fast as possible. One of the project that we started is on the Maldives. We are doing that on the coastal protection and also in the early warning system for the hazard disaster risk reduction. In one of the projects, we have also another one in Timor-Leste. It's more in the mitigation and forest resource protection, natural resource protection. But we have different other corporations in the Pacifics, and I'll just stop here, but I can enter in more details if it's necessary. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Taiji. And I'll now open these questions up to the panel, so just give me a little wave if you're interested in answering. And to jump right into things, I mean, we know that SIDS, small island developing states, are often excluded or have a harder time accessing certain green financing tools. And I'd like the panel's comments really on how these financing tools should be tailored for SIDS to engage with their specific needs. And even if you dare to comment on the loss and damage fund and what we would like to see happen with this new fund in terms of the way that it is tailored to meet the needs of SIDS. So anyone want to jump in? Sure, we'll start with you then, Emma.
I think to start with, we need to recognize that the terms just aren't fair. There's a reason that it's so hard to access funding for SIDS. For one, they're massively indebted. And if we look historically, why are they indebted? I'm a Brit, and I can tell you that it comes down to their colonial past, something that we still haven't ever really addressed in a lot of these conversations. And then we look at the fact that it's already been addressed, that they're massively vulnerable to climate change. I mean, Dominica in 2017 lost 224% of its GDP to Hurricane Maria. 224%. So when they then go to the negotiating table, how could Dominica have the capacity in terms of the legal and the negotiating capacity for it to be a fair playing field? So when they're speaking, a level playing field. So when they're speaking to a private investor, when they're speaking to ODAs, etc., it's not, there isn't a level playing field. So there needs to be some sort of system in place, some sort of entity that provides that capacity for debt negotiations, for private investment negotiations. There also needs to be much more recognition of the vulnerability. So when we look at climate finance, what really stands out is that so much of that finance is not going to those that are most vulnerable to climate change, i.e. Pacific SIDS, for example, or Caribbean SIDS. It's going to other developing countries. Now, that's all very well, but then that's not really climate, well, it's certainly not adaptation finance. And so that's something else, and I think a good solution there might be starting with an MVI, so looking at vulnerability in terms of its multidimensional nature. So an uptake of MVIs for finance allocation, and also a recognition that at the moment the least developed states are getting 7 times more climate finance than SIDS, and that those middle developing states are getting 11 times more. So what's happening here? And a lot of it is to do with pre-existing indebtedness, it's to do with credit ratings, it's also to do with the fact that when we look at blended finance, even blended finance isn't going to attract, the way it is currently, private investment for SIDS because they're still considered too risky and the scale is too small. So we need to go beyond that and start thinking, okay, well, what other mechanisms are out there? Because they're clearly not serving SIDS as they are.
Thank you very much. And definitely we should get into that conversation, the fundamental problem of how we actually measure vulnerability and to what extent that SIDS are included or excluded according to those factors, I think is very important. Would anyone else like to come in? Cheryl?
Sure, yeah. I just want to echo the comments about capacity because it really is so important for us in small island developing states, and I speak specifically about the Caribbean, to be able to access funding. It has been noted that in a lot of cases, it is quite complicated to be able to access some of the international financing facilities that are even tailored towards SIDS. The capacity of civil servants, government ministers, to be able to understand the technicalities and the terms and conditions of those instruments. How do you access them? What are the real terms once you have accessed it? There really is a need to be able to build skills in those areas. We've seen some notable examples for SIDS. So for instance, the emergence of debt for nature swaps as a financing instrument for small island developing states. And we know that Seychelles, for instance, took 7 years to come to completion. We've had Belize, and more recently we've had Barbados. Those instances have taken less time, but certainly we would want to be able to take the lessons learned from those notable examples and be able to share those experiences with other SIDS so that when they attempt to pursue those instruments, there's almost like a playbook to help them move forward. How do you build capacity in those areas? And I know there's the availability of training and funding for it, but how do we get that in place? And how do we ensure that persons who actually need to benefit from it and can then implement the solutions that it is meant to support? So I think capacity building absolutely is necessary, and just generally being able to replicate in the same way that we may do for projects aggregating and scaling, we need to do the same thing with financial instruments and financial solutions. Once we understand how they work, we need to be able to translate them into other countries and other economies in a fast but suitable way for the particular player.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And we've mentioned a few times some of the barriers that have been faced. I don't know if anyone would like to elaborate a little bit more on specifically what those barriers look like for SIDS in terms of accessing Taiji?
Thank you very much. I would like to jump in on the capacity building because our institution also think that capacity building is very important. One of the core things should be tackled. For example, we implemented a project in Samoa with the partnership with the government of Samoa. We built a climate change center in the Samoa that target the 14 countries on the regions to capacity building, for knowledge brokerage, for science research and innovation. So one of the projects that we implemented on in focus on the capacity building of the center, and we could deliver training programs and also formulate projects to access GCF. I think it's very important, this part. I think one of the barriers that we had on the time was the information. What is going to be the effect of climate change on the future? How can we predict it, and how can we make the climate rational on the area? We needed more data. But actually, we saw that Fiji has a lot of data, but in this area, they have a lot of data from the past on the region, and I think this knowledge sharing of the information, it's very important on the region as well. We are in the next project, in the disaster risk management project that we are going to implement, we are trying to use this information, through this center, spread the information for the region as well. It was one of the barriers that we thought yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taiji. I wanted to open up to the floor. If anyone has any questions now, or I'll come back to you if you have a second. That would be great. So maybe we start with Riddhi. Would you like to ask a question? We need can I borrow? There we go. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time and your insights. It's been incredibly valuable. I come from a SID in the Dutch Caribbean, the island of St. Martin. And one of the things that I've been incredibly focused on, particularly with regards to access to financing, is that there isn't often the representation for non-sovereign territories within the Caribbean who have no access to climate financing because the GCF and the Adaptation Fund and even the Loss and Damage Fund that has just been operationalized is not applicable to these non-sovereign territories because they are represented by their member states. So I just wanted to understand a little bit more about how inclusive are your initiatives. And when you're talking about vulnerable populations, I often feel that non-sovereign territories are even more vulnerable because they're in this landlocked position at the mercy of their member state for access to financing, and then also not able to apply for it on the global market. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because it's incredibly applicable to me.
Thank you very much, Riddhi. And actually, that's a really important conversation that we'll be having throughout the week on subnational jurisdictions. And in the audience, I can see Bermuda, Cayman, St. Helena represented, in addition to St. Martin, all of whom have this challenge in accessing some of these funds. And I know not all of you are necessarily able to engage with those states in the work that you do, but actually another question I had was opportunities for the private sector to engage with climate financing, which I think is one mechanism that can be used for subnational jurisdictions. Would anyone like to take a stab? Yuri?
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue for us.
Do you want to keep it?
What I would say is, in the case of IDB Lab is able to engage either through the private sector and also in an agreement with the Caribbean Development Bank. So we are able to, and we do, reach companies, and in some cases also work with local jurisdictions in development in general, not just climate finance. It is a challenge. You're right, because some of the established funds have limitations in terms of their founding regulations to be able to reach those jurisdictions, and we can't reach them through those funds, but we can reach them through our own funds. So we are able to do that. I think it's not separate from the issue of capacity building. It is absolutely difficult to generate deal flow in the Caribbean, which doesn't mean we don't try to do it. We're actually doubling down. So part of that, the third pillar of the initiative I mentioned is about setting up facilities to shorten the runway, let's say, kind of innovation speak, in terms of projects to financing. It's very transactional, but I think it's very needed. And making sure that it's democratic and it's not just the usual suspects who have access to these funds, and we're able to do it in using technology and using novel ways to really reach a wide array of particular companies or organizations that have just great ideas that we absolutely need to scale. So I think that's something, and I will chime in because I don't think anyone mentioned this before. It's obviously an issue and a solution at the same time. The climate resilience debt clauses that we have been developing. All of the multilaterals have done this. We're expanding them greatly. We are all expanding the CDRs, and the reason that's important is that a little bit paradoxically, we worked with capital markets to price in risk. Okay, so the very pricing of a risk has increased sovereign premiums for a lot of the the island states, right? And what partly we can do with these debt clauses is ensure that if there is an event, that that risk is a little bit taken off their books, right? So that really helps tremendously. It requires someone to pay for it always. So we're always working with bilateral. So maybe the compensation fund isn't the only mechanism to work with here. You can work with bilaterals and others in order to de-risk the debt clauses also. And there are many ways for you to be able to channel kind of those funds from the global north to the people who actually are going to have to pay for it. So I think that's another opportunity for us to expand.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, and I can continue a bit on the private sector in SIDS. So the SIDS have a lot of things going against them in terms of attracting the private sector to investments. Remote geographies makes for small projects. High risk perception means high cost of capital. So what are some things that you can do at the macro level and the micro level to deal with those to make it more attractive for the private sector? We talked about debt restructuring, debt for nature swaps, things like those that you can work at the sovereign level to help reduce the debt of the country, reduce the cost of capital for investing in the country. But then you look at the work of CCSA. They're working at the micro level with projects on the ground. How can you increase bankability? How can you aggregate lots of small projects into things that are investable by the private sector, and look at standardizing them into different instruments like green bonds, like resilience bonds, and those types of things that are large enough in scale for the private sector to invest in. Let's see. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for there.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. And I wanted to give a shout out to Ridhi as well, because she's been banging the drum about this issue. And I think, as far as we know, the only representative from St. Martin here at COP as part of the Island Innovation Caribbean Youth Delegation. So great job for putting that forward.
James, if I may just
okay,
jump
go on then, Cheryl. I saw some more questions as well. But
yeah, I think Tom did a great plug for us in terms of what we do as an organization. We do work with both private and public sector, but certainly in an instance such as yours, overseas territory, where the access to development finance for your country is not readily available, we certainly will refocus into private sector and other channels to help mobilize capital to support projects. But it is an issue that is concerning certainly the leaders of the region. And I just wanted to share that we are participating in a discussion later today led by the OECS and the CDB on that same question of how do we address the specific issues faced by overseas territories. So I just wanted to assure you that it is being considered, and we are looking for solutions to address their specific needs.
fantastic. I saw another question here from Celeste. Oh, we'll have to. So you can keep that one.
Hi, aloha. Celeste Connors from Hawaii. I'm the co-chair of the Local 2030 Islands Network that has both developed and developing island economies working towards these solutions. So thank you so much. And I think Cheryl and Tommy touched on it a little bit, but do you have any thoughts on solutions that, how much is community engagement factoring into the decisions you're making sort of at a macro finance level, right? And so just an example we see in Hawaii, in a developed island economy situation, we've had a terrible disaster. We lost 100 lives recently in a wildfire. A town was incinerated in 17 minutes, and the utility is now downgraded to junk status, and we're having a hard time raising capital for clean energy transition projects. So it can happen sort of in any island economy setting. But at what stage are you looking at a community engaged process to determine, especially in an island context where there is limited land for housing, food security, and any number of priorities, how are you thinking about that now when you're thinking about bankable projects and connecting those at the macro and the micro level?
Yep. So great question. The engagement question for us as an organization is centered around our own principles as a civil society organization. Diversity, equity, inclusion, gender, and ensuring that we maintain a sense of justice through all our projects. Our director of public sector projects is standing at the back of the room right now, and those are core criteria for our projects. When we engage with potential project owners, they're required to complete a questionnaire, an application through our website. And they actually, in that process, need to tick the box to say if they have factored in those concerns. We will also evaluate on our own, using our own criteria, to see if that has been done. To the extent that we also engage with international and regional donors and investors who are also focused on impact, who are focused on ESG, who are also focused on equity, there is then another layer of assessing to what extent a project or an initiative may have negative impacts, or verifying that the intended impacts can actually be achieved. So we also want to avoid the issue of greenwashing of projects in the way that we approach our assessment. So it is something that is very high on the agenda for us, certainly as an organization that is solely focused on climate action. We also as an organization want to demonstrate impact. So it is embedded into our ethos, in the way that we work, and in the way that we evaluate who we work with as partners, as projects, as well as investors. There's also, I'm sure, fairly strong layers of review from the international donor agencies as well. And we try to reinforce our process so that we can meet their requirements if we are to put forward any projects for partnership with those agencies.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Emma, do you have any comments? I also wanted to mention that you brought up Dominica earlier and the disaster that had been faced in Dominica. And this afternoon we'll be having a great film screening here at the Island of Hope about the aftermath of the hurricane in Dominica and the impacts, and also an interview with the head of of CREED, the resilience agency in Dominica, working on building a resilient state. So that'll be a great session this afternoon. Emma or any of our other panelists would like to come in? Taiji?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And in case of JICA, when we are going to implement a project or climate project or development project or both, we have in our process of feasibility study the explanation of the project for the local community and resourcing their opinions and what they have to do and what we need to do. We need to do to respond to their needs. But also we are now analyzing all our actions, climate actions, how their climate actions can make trade-off with other sustainable developments. In some cases, there are cases that there are inequity that can improve inequity, and also gender issues are not taken care. So we analyze that, and we are taking some guidelines of JICA to take all this in consideration in our projects. And that's what I want to just share with us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Do we have any more points from the audience? Maybe I'll just take a couple more points. One or two if there's any others as well, and then we'll do some final words from the panel to wrap up. So I can see one here, one there. Just go ahead, Ari.
Joe Wheeler, I'll be real quick and just acknowledge your terrible tragedy. We all, anyway. So Emma, you made a great point, which said, I'll paraphrase, at the end of the day, there has to be a limit to good things like blue bonds, because you can't just refinance national debt for the rest of your life, right? At some point, if you do that with your house, your banker says, Joe, did you lose your job? You know, what's going on? So you said maybe there'd be opportunities for other vehicles. So what does your investor group look for? And secondly, building on Mr. Howden's comments, you know, is there a role for guarantees to bring in more institutional investment, you know, folks like Fidelity, like kind of bigger pension fund money into these projects? Because this is where the deeper pockets will come from in terms of securing the future, if you know what I mean.
I'm just going to take one more point, and then we'll go along the line. So I think, was there someone else? Yes.
Hi, thanks. And this actually follows on from the last question a little bit. It's in two parts. I'm interested in what the panel views as the kind of future economies of the islands that are investable, and what innovations are coming out, and that may be answered later. But also on the other end of that question, what are the scales of financing that are useful? So we're a small ticket investor, so I don't know, having listened, whether we're useful or not in crowding in.
Okay, great. Well, there's some big questions there to wrap up in a minute or so each, but we'll just go along the row for any reflections you might have on those questions that were raised, and any final points on the panel before we wrap up, starting with you, Emma.
Yeah, I mean, conscious of time because I could talk about this for hours, but I think this sort of brings in both points in that on the one hand, we can't rely on endless bond and etc. We need to move beyond sovereign debt and sovereign bonds. So we work with the largest asset managers, asset owners globally. We work with them. We also put a lot of pressure on them because we're a charity. And something that comes up again and again, particularly off the back of we did a point of no returns. It was a survey of the largest asset managers and their performance on biodiversity and climate. And off the back of that, we've had a lot of questions about, okay, so how, you know, what does a good biodiversity policy look like? What would that strategy include? And that is where biodiversity credits have cropped up more and more. And specifically, how can we, as asset managers, or asset owners, but mostly asset managers, directly finance local community efforts? Because, let's be honest, they're not going to SIDS very often. They're mostly based in London, New York, Beijing, etc. And they don't have a pre-existing relationship. There isn't that dialogue, but they want it. And that's what I've noticed. There's been this change of, actually, we do want to know what's happening on the ground. We want to know what projects we could finance. And I think what's promising about biodiversity credits is it circumvents the issue of problematic terms, conditionality, high interest rate, high cost of capital, because these are grants, and as they should be. I mean, as they should be. Humanity isn't going to survive if we don't massively scale up biodiversity projects and climate resilience. And I think also there's a recognition that we should learn from the mistakes, I would say, of the carbon market at times, and offsets. And so now there's this desire to go beyond that and say, actually, let's finance projects and it be beyond our value. So it's not to do with offsetting our, damages or impacts in our value chain, but this is because we're aware we're not going to meet the global biodiversity framework if we don't do this. And that's where regulation needs to follow. But I think what's really important is that dialogue. We need to create a way of direct communication between local communities, between indigenous peoples that are at the forefront and have this intergenerational wisdom, and then those with the deep pockets. And there needs to be some dialogue and some sort of also oversight to make sure that where there might be a lack of capacity, I mean, I wouldn't want to take on some of these investors. So, I would need legal advice. I would need. Sorry, I'm going over, aren't I? Yeah. So, anyway, there needs to be that dialogue.
Thank you, Cheryl. Final thoughts.
Thank you. Final thoughts. To answer the question specifically, there absolutely is a role for smaller ticket investment. There is a role for patient, tolerant, risk-tolerant capital for SIDS. There's a role for catalytic grant funding and other forms of funding that really can help us mobilize and address the unique challenges that we face. And also to echo the idea that regulation, changes in the international financial architecture that we've started seeing at the sovereign level needs to trickle down into private finance, how we look at risk, and how we go about the process of greening balance sheets for financial institutions and financial services that we know needs to happen.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yuri?
Yeah, I guess my takeaway would be you kind of have to structure things so this will happen. It's not going to happen by itself. So, thanks for European Union for the $10 million donation. We're launching a climate tech accelerator and investment program in the Caribbean with an explicit focus for ecosystems that are underdeveloped. So you need to do this. If you don't, private sector is not going to go there on their own. They're not. You need to have this function of promoting. We're investors in 60 venture funds in Latin America. Next time we have, investment as an LP, we're going to insist on clauses. We want some of this investment to go to these places, okay? We're an LP. We have brand recognition. We know what we're doing. We have a lot of experience in the venture industry. We need to have our partners come in with us. A lot of time, it's lack of awareness. It's lack of understanding how you're going to do it. But these are instruments that you can use to be able to bring in the private sector. More often than not, it's going to be debt instruments in these situations. We struggle to do any equity in the Caribbean. Really, frankly, it's very difficult. But then it's debt. Do debt. That's fine. Let's use that. Let's use the instruments we can use. Okay. So I think that's just something we have to be deliberate and strategic about, and just move it forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess my final thought on navigating green finance is it's important to understand the entry points for the different types of projects that you want to have financed in your country. So if you're looking at SMEs, households, you really need to be working through the banking sector and looking how you can encourage the local banking sector through lending programs, refinancing programs, those types of things to lend for climate for those types of borrowers. If you're looking at larger, large-scale renewable projects, climate resilient infrastructure, you might be looking at national level institutional investors or large-scale corporates and investors within the country. But really global private sector and DFIs for that matter. But really global private sector is probably not going to be investing just in one country. A lot of times they're going to look at regional or global funds that are kind of theme or sector based. So how can you access and make your country a part of these global funds that then kind of diversify the risk for the private sector, whereas they wouldn't necessarily be willing to invest just in your country, but when it's combined as a region, then it becomes viable. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think 20 seconds. And what I take over, I think we, as JICA, we are just one institution. We need collaboration from all of the other institutions, private sector. And we also have some schemes of engaging the private sector, but that's what we need. We need to collaborate with the partner countries, collaborate with the other donors and different organizations on the regions, and that's what we want to do, and so we can achieve the sustainable development, climate resilient for all. That's what it's like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to all of the panelists for those interventions. Really useful and interesting panel, and I think it will help us inform the conversation for the week ahead, because at the end of the day, it all comes back to financing whatever conversation we are having. So I believe now we'll be going for a 15-minute break, and so there is this area outside that you can go to, but we'd like to see you back in 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you everyone for joining.